All right, what's going on, fellas? Let's talk a little bit about speed work today. In Lucas Hatton's most recent YouTube video with his coach Alec, they mentioned me, and I felt some of my thoughts on the ideas of speed work were a little misrepresented. Lucas had said that I wanted to debate Alex, and Alex was like, oh, well, he's gonna lose. And then there was kind of like this thing about how I just heavy-handedly force linear progressions onto people until they stop working inevitably. There was a bit in there about how I'm gonna inevitably like have Max burn out and get hurt, which that rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. I take a great bit of pride in my coaching of Max. You know, we're 11 years in, Natty, 800, 500, 800, still having a big aerobic base, still maintaining the ability to do a lot of non-specific training that similar level tested supers just aren't able to do without a significant injury to date. So I take a lot of pride in that, and I think, oh, you see the young age and you see what is on his Instagram is specific training. Well, there's a lot of stuff we don't film because it's fucking boring. And you also have to factor in the training age, right? If we look at like Timur, who's only like a year older than Max and is one of the top supers, is his training also too specific? But honestly, that's completely beside the point. I wanted to talk about the speed work thing. That little bit, I messaged Lucas and Alec. I don't dislike them at all. This isn't supposed to be a beef video in the slightest. I like those guys. We'll talk it out. It's really not a big deal. Rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, but that's whatever. I wanted to talk about some of my thoughts on speed work in particular. Now, a bit of context, as I understand it. If I get something wrong, my bad. I'm not trying to misrepresent anyone. Lucas is, in my opinion, a top 10 strongman in the world. He is prepping for Brian Shaw's Strongest Man on Earth. Amazing, amazing athlete. Kind of came from a varied background of throwing, got into a little bit of weightlifting, did a little bit of powerlifting, and then really kind of snowballed into strongman. Alec comes from an Olympic weightlifting background. I believe that's what he has competed in, and has largely specialized now within strongman coaching. Right? I regard Alec as a top 3 coach in the world comfortably within the world of strongman. And I'm sure he does have some powerlifters. Anybody that does strength coaching coaches at least a couple powerlifters. And I would say his pedigree as a coach is far higher than mine, right? He coaches Inez, he used to coach Aaron Murray, he coaches Lucas Hatton, among a bunch of other very, very high level athletes, right? So if we're just saying well, who do you coach card? Sure, you're blowing me out of the water. I might contend, I think I've produced more results within powerlifting, which is what we're going to get into because that's maybe where I thought the critique went astray. I have no issue with speed work for strongman, and we're about to get into why I think that might be a great use of time depending on the athlete. But within powerlifting, I think I've produced 4 or 5 500 plus dots, both tested and untested, a couple of 800 meat pulls, I think I've produced some good results, right? Maybe more than Alec. Maybe I'm wrong based on what he's reposted and hasn't reposted. Of course, his strongman athletes could be good powerlifters if they transitioned over, but we're talking about the sport of powerlifting. Alec and Lucas don't really like powerlifting, which is totally fine. It's a bit of a boring sport. And they're not kind of a fan of what kind of athlete that turns people into or the culture of it. And honestly, I kind of get those critiques. But I also think that maybe means that they are not keeping as close of an eye on the practices of the highest performers of this era in the same way that I am. Maybe in the super heavyweight class, maybe in other weight classes, right? Because if you're convinced there's hundreds of studies that prove speed work is great, you'd be better, like you're not gonna be the best squatter without speed work. That would mean that everybody at the top, every high performer within tested powerlifting across basically all weight classes is doing it wrong and you guys are doing it right. And that because they're not doing dedicated speed work, as very few athletes do at the top of tested powerlifting at the moment, they're all making a mistake. We've got the secret sauce. And I don't necessarily agree with that. Which kind of gets to the general idea of what is speed work, right? You've got this idea of a training principle, which is compensatory acceleration, which is mean we should be practicing the skill of outputting maximal force into submaximal weights to get better at outputting maximal force. Just on our warm-ups, we stand forcefully. Fred Hatfield was very big on this. Josh Bryant, very high performing powerlifting coach, very, very big on this principle. I have no issue with this in the slightest. To me, that is a central tenet of training. Thomas Lilly, who I regard as one of the best powerlifting coaches in the world, maybe top 3, especially if we go on the untested side of things, I'd probably put him top 3, is actually very big on slowing down a lot of your warm-ups and chasing positional excellence rather than compensatory acceleration. But that is what it is. That is a training principle that I'm pretty big on. Speed work aside is dedicated work. Depending on who you listen to, maybe we could go all the way down to like 40%, maybe up to like 70, 75, 80%, right? Alec would argue that like, well, there is no real specific loading. We're just using bar speed as a training parameter. There's no such thing as insufficiently light. There's just moving different loading profiles in different velocity ranges. And that's all fine. I really don't have any gripes there. But we are talking about training with a good number of RIR to whatever protocol we're talking about, whether it's EMOMs, whether it's the old West Side, like 10 doubles every minute on the minute at 50% with accommodating resistance. It's work where our primary overload parameter and what makes a successful session is our bar velocity at these submaximal weights. That was kind of roughly how we're going to define this. Now, when we're talking about strongman and weightlifting, where being an explosive athlete is a very, very important outcome, it would be well beyond my scope to tell you that doesn't make sense. That would be stupid. It makes perfect sense, right? Being explosive is a trait that is rewarded within the sport. Why not utilize some motions we're already doing as another means to become more explosive? We're already squatting, we're already deadlifting. Why not kind of apply that principle? And it becomes doubly so when you are unbelievably strong like Lucas is. I've talked about this a lot on the channel. When you look at exotically strong big guys who are moving the biggest absolute weights, their recovery curve from a heavy session will often push them towards what often was like called the Lilly Bridge method, which is week 1 is light squats and heavy deads. Week 2 is heavy squats and light deads, right? To match up the longer recovery curves that come with those high absolute weights. Now for a strongman, a lot of guys lean into this scheme. Someone like Thor does like lighter pauses. Don't know what Mitch does. They talked about this in the video. I would contend that doing speed work with those main lifts is a wonderful use of those down weeks, and I would kind of actually agree with Lucas and Alec that it is a better use of those down weeks because, okay, cool, we need to use lighter weights to allow for this longer recovery. We want to practice our technique a bit, so a pattern that looks kind of like the main lift, but we don't want to accumulate a ton of fatigue. Cool, we check that box of a little bit of practice, keep our motor patterns in touch, keep kind of things being second nature, not having to overly think about how we're moving. And why not? Okay, well, we're not training for this big maximal stimulus for hypertrophy or for strength or for kind of neural efficiency. We have this fourth outcome that's important. Why not, if it's not that fatiguing comparatively, use that as our down week and become a better athlete for it? I agree 1,000,000,000%. I think that's something that they do phenomenally well. And, right now people aren't familiar with it as an athlete and people are like, oh, Lucas Hatton is so statically strong. He's a big guy. Lucas moves better than anybody built like that I've ever seen. He's very fast, very explosive, and that's because of his training. It's not just a genetic strong suit, like maybe like someone like Pavlo Nekonechny ran bizarrely fast. And it's not because they run a lot in training. It's because Pavlo's a freak. Luke is certainly a gifted athlete, but what you see is largely because of their huge emphasis of that in training. So I have no doubt that the use of bar speed at whatever loading profile, whatever velocity range you want to use, overloading that parameter absolutely makes you a more explosive athlete when it comes time to put something over your head using your leg drive, when it comes time to do a bag toss, when it comes time to do any speed event like a yoke, right? Working on those properties is a great use of time, and there's no disagreement there. In the video, they said, oh, Sam 100% thinks there's zero chance that it carries over to maximal strength. And that's not what I said. I said I have some skepticism, like how much it is a driver of top-end strength, and that's kind of been reflected by the methodologies that have been moved towards as powerlifting does creep forward in results. The use of dynamic effort as a driver used to be prevalent. Now it is not prevalent. I have no doubt that, yeah, sure, if you move 70% faster than you used to move 70% in some capacity, you probably are stronger. But is that our best means of driving forward? Especially if you're someone in a lighter weight class with less absolute load shifted, could that training economy potentially be better used? A lot of coaches would say Yes, that could, and that's kind of where that shift has happened. Alec is contending for the most part that those people are wrong. Now, I myself, as a competitive strongman, have actually been getting into velocity-based training. I'm actually getting a bar speed tracker here soon because I have zero doubt it will improve my abilities as a strongman. And who knows, maybe I'm wrong. I'm perfectly open to that idea. You know, I don't claim to be the greatest coach on earth. I'm just some guy, and I help some other guys. Totally open to the idea that, hey, once I start doing this, I see more carryover from it to my upper end strength than I expected. Cool, I'll walk it back a little bit, but I don't necessarily like the implication that everybody within tested powerlifting is doing it wrong, and they'd be better if we did it XYZ way. I imagine many of them have tried. So to kind of summarize what I'm getting at here with some of my thoughts, no doubt for its application within the field of strongman and potentially weightlifting, using that as an overload parameter. I also think it, honestly, with the training for powerlifting potentially, or 1RM potentially, if that's just how we're defining it, it makes a tremendous amount of sense if they need to have a down week. So if that's what our training economy allows for, I think that's better than just coming in and doing some mailed in light sets of pause squats where there isn't an overload parameter. There's no way to win that session aside from maybe your technique being good, which I guess Thomas Lilly would argue that should be the objective of the light day. Great coach, ton of respect, crazy results. Really like that guy, but sure, I actually agree. I'm like, okay, well, if that's what our training economy, that's what it'll allow for our down weeks, then I think it's a great use of the down week, and you'll be slightly better than if you just mailed in your down weeks for the sake of rest. So within the context of supers, okay, cool, that also makes sense. But if we have the training economy for something else, I would just push back on, and maybe I'll change my idea with more experience. Once I have this bar speed tracker, maybe this will be the first thing I big time walk back on the channel, because I don't think I usually am so averse to making controversial statements. I don't think I've had a big walk back yet. So maybe I will. But I don't think, if we've got the training economy to do a couple of different options, I don't think attacking submaximal bar speed. So I get, again, Alec would say it's not submaximal, it's maximal for the intended velocity range. But we're just talking in terms of 1RM because we're potentially talking about powerlifting here. If we've got the training economy to do something else, I would argue that there's different overload parameters that might be a better use of time. Now for periods of the year, sure, but that's all I'm saying is I'm not sure that if we have a good bit of training economy, if that would be my avenue through which to attempt to drive up maximal strength. And then, I said Lucas would be a elite squatter regardless. Alex said, but he wouldn't be the best. I'm assuming he means the best either at strongest man on earth or the best squatter he could be, in which term, fair enough. Obviously, Lucas is a tremendous athlete. I've got a ridiculous amount. I'm just so impressed watching everything Lucas does. He does things well. He's very thought out. And unlike a lot of guys who are thought out, he also trains very hard, which scratches an itch that I like to see, right? I like Lucas a lot. I think he's an amazing athlete, so I'm not detracting from him, but I don't know what his 1RM is. He just hit a ridiculous squat set with more in the tank. I would say it's safe to say that he's still got a ways to go before like Ray Williams 1080 in sleeves, for example, to be like truly the best of the best in terms of squatting for 1RM, which I understand that's not strongman, but that is what we were talking about, I guess, when we talk about this critique potentially. Now, could someone who's squatting every other week make themselves even a little bit better by not just mailing it in? Sure, but I definitely don't think that is the make or break necessarily, especially, and this is something I forgot to say earlier, if they are implementing the habit of compensatory acceleration, so all of their warm-ups are being moved forcefully and their lighter work on the light weeks is being moved forcefully. I don't know if measuring and overloading and hitting PRs in terms of speed parameters would make you all that much better, but honestly that really isn't the point. I just wanted to throw that in there because that was something that was discussed. Then the rest of kind of what was talked about. Those are my thoughts. People ask me about it all the time. I just don't talk about it very much. I think that would kind of cover a lot of my thoughts. Maybe I could clarify some things better because I didn't write this out beforehand. I just saw it this morning. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, rustled my jimmies a little bit, so I just tossed down the camera and banged this out. I just talked to Lucas. Like I said, Lucas is a very nice guy. They're just bantering. It's really not a big deal. But it still rubbed me the wrong way, so I'm still just going to talk about my thoughts on speed work because people ask pretty regularly. Those, I think, if I phrase that all right, I should have planned this out ahead of time, my bad, would summarize kind of the questions a lot of you guys have been asking me about its utility. I use it myself as a strongman. I find especially every minute on the minute protocols are really good for reinforcing your technique and improving your setup. So it might not be enough weight to cause breakdown, but we're practicing that skill of outputting maximal force into a sub-maximal weight each rep. And we're also getting more setups in, more finding our midfoot on the negative on the squat, more tensioning our start position and tensioning our start position in the bench press or the deadlift, which are all pretty integral skills that I think a lot of people are underskilled at. And I think that every minute on the minute protocol is a really, really good fast feedback loop for improving form. Your mistakes and the feelings of those mistakes stay fresh in your head until the next one, and you can make rapid adjustments that maybe do a set, rest 5 minutes, do a set. A lot of that will fade out of your head. So I really like them as like a secondary role for kind of improving my setup, improving my technique. Bromley likes them for not getting you hung up on overthinking your setup. If some guy's like always fitzing around at the bottom of the deadlift, give him an EMOM. It'll punish waiting too long because then you're immediately going to have to go again. So it can kind of get you out of your head. I like those EMOM protocols. So I think that would summarize a lot of my thoughts on speed work, at least reasonably well, unless I really mess something up, which who knows, maybe I'll leave you guys a comment what I fucked up in terms of my opinion there. So the next bit was Lucas said, oh, like Sam wants you to debate you about this. I never said the word debate. I said that to Lucas. I know that's nitpicking, but it definitely does phrase it as a lot more adversarial than I would ever like to be. There's a reason I don't believe in debates. I don't think it's a good way to exchange ideas genuinely. I think discussions are better. So maybe that set things off on the wrong foot. It was just the wrong word. And Alec was like, oh yeah, well, Sam will lose. There's literally tons of studies proving this. And I would kind of push back on directly what those studies are proving. I'm reasonably well read myself in terms of exercise science literature. We could get into that maybe when I have him on for a discussion. Because like I said, I got no problem with these guys at all. And I do intend to talk to Alec about this directly at some point. But then he was just like, obviously this was just a passing comment when they were like taking the piss in training. But he goes, oh yeah, if you move 80% like 70% used to move, dare I say your 1RM has gone up? And it's like, yeah, I don't disagree with that in the slightest. I just don't find that to be a compelling argument. That could be very easily correlational, not causal. That doesn't necessarily mean that training economy you're spending to you do that couldn't have been better spent. Of course, yes. Is there a relationship between bar speeds at different percentage ranges and your 1RM? Absolutely, that is established. I don't disagree with that. I just mean like taking a certain amount of training economy and using that to attack different velocity ranges and overloading the weight you can hit in those ranges, whether that is the best use of training economy for all athletes, especially within the sport of powerlifting. Sometimes some people might respond really well to it, but to say by and large everybody should do it, I'm going to push back on heavily because again, I've got a lot of respect. There's a lot of very strong, very smart powerlifting coaches out there that have read the same studies that I've read, have read the same studies that Alec have read, and gradually come to the conclusion of the current meta of high-level powerlifting, which I know Lucas and Alec hate. But again, I'm just going to push back on that idea a bit. So yeah, that's the whole bit. I was debating kind of going into why I strongly disagree, obviously, that I think I'm going to get Max hurt, varying anywhere from his training age being really long, his aerobic base being pretty big. Yes, generally, a lot of my athletes lean into American block periodization, which I know Alec is not a huge fan of because it works until it doesn't, but I would also contend that I use it until it doesn't, right? It's not as though when that runs dry, I just keep forcing it. As I said, I've had quite a few athletes hit like 500 dots, and their training does tend to, as they get higher and higher level, it tends to diverge into what ultimately looks more unique based on their weight class, based on their techniques they use, right? Like my high-level sumo deadlifters, you got a couple of guys deadlifting 800 sumo, a couple of guys conventional. Their training looks wicked different, and we ultimately move into pretty different looking periodization schemes, especially for the sumo deadlifters. as they get more and more advanced. But yeah, the majority of my athletes are going to follow something that looks like 8 to 12 week blocks and try to get better each block. And then as we find what works for them, it kind of stratifies from there. I hope that's what the word stratify means, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't claim to be the greatest coach in the world, but I also claim to not be a bad coach. So that one, whatever. Like I said, like we can get into some context of what we actually do with Max, and it's not just forcing him into 10-week blocks. I would say it's a little bit more, rather than American block periodization, it's more like traditional block periodization, where based on our proximity to competition, things get less specific and we focus more in like a work capacity phase, a hypertrophy phase, then maybe a strength phase, rinse and repeat. We don't force into the peak, or we'll do a bottom-up emerging strategy. If something's working really well and we don't have a competition on the horizon, we will stay within that loading parameter, kind of like the reactive training systems, Mike Tushar stuff. We will use that in the off season if we're really hitting a sweet spot. We don't see we're going to overaccumulate fatigue anytime soon. So I get it. What we put out there is American block, but obviously, like you said, it works until it doesn't work. But I, hand on heart, promise I'm not making people do things that I don't think work.